Okay, got kind of a new old project going this time. So about a year and a half ago, when I was first learning Angular, I put together an application called ourChecklists, which was a way of managing checklists, so creating checklists, adding information related to those checklists, running it as a community of checklists, so someone could design it and other people could use those checklists, and also being able to report on the checklists and the attributes of the checklist. So say there's just one thing on the checklist, say on a checklist about auto repair, but we're just interested in seeing how we're doing for, say, just oil changes and auto repair. So on checklists there may be an oil change checklist item, and we just want to get metrics on across all our checklists, how we're doing on oil changes. So it supports that sort of thing as well. Like I said, I did this when I was just learning Angular, so I think it's worthwhile to go back. I'm going to use my fbmStarter application and convert what I did originally using sort of what I've learned since then. Again, it'll still be a Firebase based application, but it's going to use material design rather than bootstrap design. Also under the hood there'll be a lot of changes as well, so let's get started, have a look. So I'm going to update our checklists, really apply what I've learned about Angular and Firebase over the last year or so. So I created this, like I said, about a year ago as my first Angular application. I was using Firebase Firestore. So some of the changes I need to make, I was using Bootstrap as the UI framework. Now I'm using Material. I'll just go through the application a bit so you can see what it's doing, and I'll just mention where I think I'll make changes as I go along. So let's sign in. So I wasn't using the normal authentication library, so I'd written some of these pop-ups myself. So we'll change it back to what my starter authentication uses. So the idea with checklists is you can create checklists, share checklists. The checklists are kind of richer than just a straight list of check boxes that you check off. It's going to have material behind each checklist item for more education, more background on what it means and what you're required to do for the sign off on the checklist. It's also, I set it up to allow you to get good metrics out of the checklist. So if you have a certain sort of checklist, so you can easily pull the data from the checklists and get reports on, you know, how many of the checklists were actually completed, what items on the checklist people had the difficulty with, or if it's a scoring system where people were having trouble meeting the requirements of the checklist. Also, this was set up, initial idea was this would run on the public internet, so you know there could be thousands, millions of people using it in theory. So some of the structure for visibility and access to different parts of and different checklists was probably a bit more involved than it needed to be. So set up the whole thing with the idea of having communities of people that could have specialized checklists. So it could be, say, a fishing group could just create their own community and just see checklists that are for the fishing community, but could do things like create a good checklist maybe about say towing or something to do with fishing, and publicize it and share it with other communities if they wanted. This time around I'm going to take the approach of this being an enterprise application, so sort of having a limit, or thinking about there being a limit on the number of people, and there already being a community that is related to the enterprise anyway, so don't need to make it so finicky for managing visibility and access across the different checklists and different communities. So let's have a quick look at sort of things we see in here. So say for software, there's an example of a checklist around requirements management, and it ties into CMI's requirements management requirements. And you see here the general format of the checklist is there's a header, there's checklist items. You have access to the checklist both as just a person who works on the checklist, or maybe someone who's designing the checklist and designing the checklist items. Again, this was set up to revolve around communities, so you can see in here there's access to things like the communities that you as a user have access to. If you're an administrative user, you also have the ability to do things like create new communities. Again, there's kind of involved process about if you created a community that you then became the leader of the community, you could have special rights in that community to create checklists, manage checklists, assign checklists. As well, there's a categorization scheme around sort of at the highest level themes. So a theme could be things like you see here cooking or science and technology, very wide ranging themes, and then under that categories of that could be applied to both the checklists, and also there was a categorization on the checklist items. So again, thinking about software, you could have checklist items that are marked as only pertaining to activities to do with, say, requirements management, or even a sub topic around requirements management, and then just get metrics on those. So this shows the structure I was using in Firestore database for our checklists. So I'll just go through comment on what these different structures were used for, maybe some reasons about why I made some of the design decisions I did, and some changes I may make for the new version of our checklists. Okay, so one collection was called checklists, had a checklist document for each checklist. I also had a separate collection called checklist items. So this was the actual items under the checklist, so the things that you were checking off. In this first version, I didn't make checklist items a sub-collection of checklists, but in future I'll be able to do that. So before, there was a restriction in Firestore, I couldn't put a one index over all the checklist items if they were sub-collections. Now I can, so sort of solves that problem, so I can make a more direct connection between checklists and checklists item. Something else, so kind of central to the old version of our checklists was the use of communities. So my original idea was to sort of make a checklist application that could be used on the internet. So, you know, in theory you could have millions of users of it. So I used the idea of communities to be able to break up and manage small groups of checklists and users who have access to that those checklists. So you see this communities item was kind of the organizing factor for being able to have users who have only access to checklists that are in certain communities, have all the authentication and authorization management via the communities. Next version of checklists, I'm going to try and simplify it a bit, so think more of putting it together as an enterprise application than an internet one, so I can sort of back off on how strongly I was using communities in the new version. I may still use them, but some of the restrictions and logic behind communities and users and checklists I can pull back a little bit. For categorization, so checklists could be used for different things in the enterprise. So, you know, depending on the enterprise, it can have checklists for, say, process management, for software, for product design, all sorts of things, whatever that enterprise was working on. And again, on the internet, it could have even a wider range of categories. So I sort of had a two-level hierarchy. One was a high-level theme, so things like maybe hobbies, science, very top-level themes and then categories that were part of themes. So under, say, software theme, we could have design, coding, the different languages, so could have a category for each of those. I may still do that in the new version, but again, I may loosen sort of the structure of this for being more manageable in an enterprise and just simplifying the whole thing. Something else I wanted in the old version and in the new version was checklist items. So I wanted to be able to put metrics together or reports on how well teams might be doing as they check off checklist items. So maybe they're working on a certain checklist, say for automotive repair, and there's certain things that they check off, and those things may be grouped into, what I was doing was grouping them into activities. So I could get a report on, you know, how many for a certain activity, say checking the oil. I could have an activity around checking the oil and then look at all the checklist items that fall under that activities. Again, they are grouped into communities, those activities, or into categories. So I could do some fairly sophisticated reporting of what the results were in the checklist items and group them by, again, activities, communities, and categories. I may still do that, but again, because I'm going to do this at the enterprise level rather than at the sort of the whole world internet level, I can probably back off and make this a little bit more flexible than I did in the last version.